Hi, friends. My name is Mike O'Connell. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm so excited to get to be a little bit nerdy today and talk about my favorite model of therapy to use with my clients, which is called restoration therapy. I have been using restoration therapy most of my career, and I absolutely love it and find that it's very effective to use with my clients and that they get a lot from the experience of going through it. Not to mention it's pretty straightforward and simple to understand, which really helps people to tap in to what we're doing in the room. Now, restoration therapy actually is rooted and comes from a model of therapy called contextual family therapy, which to understand restoration therapy, we need to understand contextual. So let's talk about contextual family therapy first, which will lead us into talking about restoration therapy, or what I'm going to start referring to as RT. So contextual therapy was founded by Ivan Borzmiany-Nagy, and he was a psychotherapist in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s who really championed this psychodynamic approach that he referred to as contextual family therapy. Now, what was really interesting about contextual family therapy was that it really emphasized the ethical dimensions of relational ethics. So basically, really jumped into how those ethics really bond and hold communities together, and really develop this idea of what we understand is fair. And a lot of times when folks come to therapy, there's usually some sort of question going on as to what is fair. I feel like something was unjust, something wasn't right that happened in my life, and now I want to examine and look at it and try to understand how I fit into all of that. Now, for Naj, he really viewed people and assessed people based on what he referred to as the four-dimensional framework. So essentially, people have a lot of layers to them, but if we understand those layers within these four dimensions, it helps us to really organize and make sense of where people are coming from. So those four dimensions look like this. So the first dimension is going to be just the facts about the person. So that really is looking at the history. That's looking at just the straight facts of who that person is. So that might be gender, race, height and size, weight, things like that, and how that contributes and impacts their life. Just those simple facts about who we are. The next dimension that we might look at is psychology. And here we might specifically look at any psychodynamic pieces that are going on that might contribute to how a person understands their life and their individual differences. So there you might see things like sometimes even mental health pieces that go along with it. So ADHD or depression issues that might be contributing to that. How does that impact the person's life, and what does that look like? Next being transaction, and really what we're talking about there are family dynamics. So those transactional dynamics, those family systems issues that we come from, but those also might be larger issues too, like maybe cultural issues that impact a person, how they understand how they fit into the world. And then finally, and this is going to be the real big one, but how that person understands that dimension of relational ethic, really looking at that interpersonal fairness. Now, no dimension is different than any other. That fairness one is unique to contextual, but really it's going to be looking at in these different dimensions. It's going to allow the therapist an opportunity to really get to understand and know the people in the room and where they're coming from. And so as the therapist looks at these four dimensions and really tries to understand how the person is operating and working and living and interpreting those different dimensions, the therapist is going to be empowered to really get to know and to build trust with each person in the room. Now, the neat part then is with that, we get to really see how those different dimensions are then passed on through the generations. And so the way that might look, and please don't judge my art as I pull this up, but the way that this might look is we might think of these four dimensions as like a megaphone. And so the way I usually describe it to clients is that all of us are carrying around an invisible megaphone. Now that megaphone speaks into the world a lot of different things, and it speaks those four dimensions. And so, especially as we think of a first generation, so parents, right? Your mom or dad might have been holding their megaphone, and they shared their facts and their interactions with you, those transactions, those family transactions with you. So those pieces are put into the mouthpiece of that megaphone, and then it's run through that filter of our psychology, and then comes out into the world in how we understand the fairness between the give and take relationship. Well, that then from that generation moves then onto that second generation, and each previous generation then is going to have their own megaphone, which they're going to do that same thing. So for me, for example, I might look at some of these facts that contribute into who I am, right? As a white heterosexual male who is rather short, who is socioeconomically probably somewhere in the middle class, right? All of these things contribute to who I am, and I can't escape that. That's a part of how I view the world. And then on top of that, I can look at the interactions that I have that come from my family and come from my culture. So being an American and how we in America might do things, simple thing, that we might look at is if you go to another country, they might not tip when you go to a restaurant, whereas we tip. And so those little things, those little interactions that we have with people might be a little bit confusing at times. Now we take those things and we put it through that megaphone and understand it then through our own psychology. How do I make sense of those things? What are some of the ways in which my brain interprets it and looks at it? And that really then directly impacts the way that I perceive fairness in the world and how I relate to that. And so, where contextual therapy is going to want to step in is really paying attention to this megaphone and listening for where people are trying to understand things, trying to make sense of things, trying to find change and healing in things. Are you talking about just you're curious about some of the facts about who you are and what's going on? Are you looking at some of the interactions and from the family that you come from and how that might be different from what you're experiencing now? Is it maybe a little bit of just basic psychological things like I'm really struggling with focus? And what does that mean? Or maybe then it's also got a lot to do then with I'm really a little bit stuck with that fairness question. Something happened and I don't feel like it was fair in that relationship, and it's causing me a lot of distress. And so by using that four-dimensional framework, contextual therapists are then able to really hold for people what all of that they're bringing into the room and what they want to do. And so a contextual therapist is going to spend a lot of time really paying attention and giving each person the opportunity to explore that and know which dimension that they're going into. This is what Naz referred to as multi-directed partiality. So one thing that makes contextual therapy very different is that there is no such thing as a monster or a victimizer. It doesn't mean that people don't do bad things, but people have reasons based on their dignity of just being humans. And so the therapist's job, regardless of what the situation is to really get to know deeply and intimately with each person in the room their point of view, why they did the thing, why they do the things that they do, why they think the way that they do. And then as the therapist uses intervention within those dimensions, the therapist's job is to think about how that impacts that larger piece here. And so that multi-directed partiality stance allows the therapist to really make sense of what's going on here so that it has the most impact in the larger way, that question of fairness, right? And so in doing so, we're really able to recognize the impact that we can have on relationships, but especially those vertical relationships. So in other words, those relationships that go specifically through the generations. So grandparents to parents to children, and so on and so on and so on. So encountering these dimensions and making sense of them really help us to make sense of and understand all of the different layers people bring into the room, and then how we are supposed to encounter those things and help with those things and really make sense of those things. Now, in contextual therapy, then, a healthy relationship is going to be a relationship that then is finding balance in the give and take, right, of that big bell curve there, basically that questions of ethics and fairness. Now, in doing so, we're really looking at something very specific, and this is going to be huge to contextual therapy, which is we're looking at merit and obligation, or rights and responsibilities, or really just to make that super easy to understand, we're looking at the give and take in the relationship. Now, when patterns of dysfunction arise in those interpersonal relationships between folks, we would refer to this as destructive entitlement. Now, in other words, something happened, right, in the relationship, and I felt like it was unfair, and now I feel entitled to get something that is owed to me. So instead of working to earn it, I feel the need to get back what I feel like I lost. So in a way, I'm really breaking any opportunity for trust, even in little ways sometimes, right? Even those little ways in which I might do that. So little ways in my family in which I might not, just to make something up off the fly. Maybe I don't ever pick up my socks at the end of the day. Well, that's an entitlement that I'm feeling entitled to that might really impact the other members of my family. By not picking up my socks, that's sending out a little message. Now, it seems like a little thing, but it's impacting others. And why am I not taking accountability for it? Well, that is the question that we're wanting to get after, because a lot of times that destructive entitlement is what's going to really impact the rest of those dimensions of who I am, and really impact then how I interact with other people, and just the basic context of the world that I end up living. So from there, then, as that destructive entitlement is formed and really takes hold, and we see patterns start to form, then people start keeping ledgers, and that's going to be a very important piece. And by ledgers, I really mean just like a tally sheet of, this is how you wronged me. I felt like I was owed this and you didn't do it. Remember how, I made you that meal the other day? Well, why didn't you make me a meal the next day? I'm going to keep my ledger. Remember how you didn't do that thing right before? Remember how you were supposed to get gas on the way home and you didn't? Well, I'm going to keep a tally of that, right? And so there becomes this back and forth of ledger keeping that oftentimes happens when there's this big destructive entitlement pattern that's going on, especially between spouses. It might be um, parents and children, it might be siblings, whoever those different relationships are, that we really start keeping that. It could also be work relationships or friendship relationships that are really going to contribute to that. But in all of those instances, we're also looking at the vertical relationship. So what is that entitlement I received, my understanding of that? And then how does it then go out into the relationships where I'm equal, which we would refer to as horizontal relationships. So those horizontal relationships would basically be everybody else. So spouses, coworkers, friends, strangers, those would be your horizontal relationships in which I owe something and I can expect something in return. In those vertical relationships, is that up and down. It always goes downstream. It doesn't necessarily go upstream. So in other words, a child can never repay mom and dad for the gift of life. Now, we can do things for mom and dad. We can do things to celebrate them, but we can't ever really repay them. So there's a way in which that vertical relationship always speaks into us, whether our parents were great saints or whether they were just kind of the worst, or if they were just really good parents. That vertical relationship is always going to speak down and into the child, and not necessarily swim back upstream. Again, it doesn't mean you can't give something to your parents and that you can't have a balance with your parents. The expectation is going to be different. With spousal or horizontal relationships, there's going to need to be a balance in the ledgers, and that's going to be the critical part that people usually come in and want to talk about. I was wanting to give love so that I could take love, but I couldn't do that, and it caused a lot of pain, caused that really destructive piece to it. And so when we have a balanced horizontal relationship, a healthy relationship, we might see something like, I have that sort of merit built up, that take built up, where I can take from the relationship love, respect, care, intimacy, primarily because I've been able to give those things in the relationship, and it creates that balance. I was obligated to give care, respect, love, intimacy. I think they did those in the wrong order, but you get the point that you got that balance. That imbalance in the relational ledger, though, is the hard part. Maybe I was looking to give respect, but I wasn't able to take, or maybe I was looking to take some respect, but I wasn't able to give it back. And those are going to be the questions where people come in, because at that point, what we start see forming are some sort of issue when it comes to loyalty. Now, loyalty in that contextual framework is really going to be looking at what are some of the loyalties of entitlement that people are carrying with them that specifically comes from that vertical relationship. So, in other words, there might have been little ways all of us we had parents that unintentionally created a certain loyalty based around their own sense of pain. So, in other words, I might have learned to take care. It was my job to take care of mom and dad by doing this, or I couldn't do this, or I had to take this. And even if we have really good parents, there's going to be some level of that. Now, in the most extreme cases, when we're talking maybe abuse or trauma in that vertical relationship, then that just means that the coping is going to be that much more extreme. The loyalty is going to be that much more extreme. So, as an example of maybe what I mean by that, maybe it's something uh, as simple as in my family, I might come from a really good family, but there was a loyalty around sort of not ever speaking ill about the family outside the family, or ever talking ill about the family outside the family. And so then now, as I get married, and maybe I have kids, and as I need help or I need to find help, I'm still loyal to that piece, that you don't go outside the family, that you keep it kind of bottled up and bottled in. That's just a little example of a very easy way in which those loyalty conversations come in. Again, if there's more extreme versions of that are passed down, you're going to just see more extreme pieces. So if there's issues of divorce, where or of not well, divorce would be part of that, but issues of abuse, say for example, where the child maybe was expected to give everything because the parent wanted to take everything. Well, at that point, now we're also speaking about parentification. So at that point, in the contextual idea, the child was expected to be the responsible one. The child was expected to be the parent for the adult. And as that carries on into other relationships, it becomes very difficult for the person to be able to transfer that idea. And so at that point, that person might be looking to either make amends for that past hurt from mom and dad, or they might be looking to carrying on those sort of things. So I was expected to give everything to mom and dad. I was expected to take care of their pain. So I'm going to give everything to my spouse. I'm going to take care of everything for my spouse, or take care of everything for my children. Now, vice versa, it might be the other way around too, of I experienced abuse and now I want to abuse. So those parentification moments are going to play a big part into what we're looking at and how that impacts the dimensions that people have. Now, if the important part, though, is once we kind of get a handle on all that and understanding of all that, you're using that multi-directed partiality to really understand where each person in the room is coming from. You're getting an idea of their megaphones and what's happening. Well, at that point, we can really start working to develop some predictable and open give and take in the relationship, which is going to earn entitlement. So again, if I've depleted my ledger, I've done nothing but take, but haven't given anything. The great thing is there's always an opportunity to do that. As soon as we get to that space where we can kind of open things up a little bit, and a person can start doing that and earning entitlement, then we can start rebalancing those ledgers, which is the goal. Now, the ultimate goal in contextual therapy is going to be that work towards exoneration, which means essentially that something happened, right? There are hurts that happened in that ledger. There was a lot that was going on. Now we're working on building up trust, building up fairness, rebalancing that ledger, coming to an understanding. And now we're going to work towards exoneration, which is basically to balance those debts out, find forgiveness, and regardless of the outcome, that's going to be the important part. So it might be that I am working to really come to grips with a parent's alcohol abuse that's always been present throughout my life and how that impacted me. Part of that work of exoneration is being able to get to that point where, regardless of how my parent responds now, I can put them into perspective, and I have agency over that at this point. That work of exoneration is really difficult to get to because, again, especially in those vertical relationships, it's always going to impact us in some little way, shape, or form. But once I get to that point of exoneration and I can really put those things in perspective and decide what I want to do with that hurt and that loyalty and all and that imbalanced ledger, I can rebalance the ledger myself. And especially if you're in couples and family context, if the rest of the family will do it with me, it can lead to huge, huge, huge benefits and really rebalance those ledgers as a whole and find some level of homeostasis within the family that really helps everything to balance out. So that's the ultimate goal of contextual therapy, and that's really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. But it's important to understand that background to understand restoration therapy, since that's where restoration therapy is really rooted and came out of. So a lot of what RT is going to be talking about points back to that question, for example, of fairness, and is really going to be looking at that question of fairness and what I owe in the give and take, what I owe and what I earn in the give and take of a relationship and how that impacts my life. So let's move on then to restoration therapy and get an understanding of what that is and what that type of therapy looks like. So restoration therapy was developed by Terry Hargrave and Franz Feitzer, and it is a wonderful philosophical theoretical orientation that embraces not only that contextual framework, but also embraces attachment theory. It embraces emotional self-regulation, embraces mindfulness, and really seeks to find that fairness and balance in people's lives and in their relationships. And so this is the book that Terry and Franz wrote. I don't know if that'll, looks a little bit bright. But you can see that there. So Terry Hargrave started out really in contextual therapy, and then as time progressed, really kind of realized he was still in a lot of ways steeped in that, but was starting to do something a little bit different, especially as attachment theory was really coming to be more understood in the mainstream. Mindfulness practice was being more understood. The impacts of the brain and our understanding of the brain were really exploding. And so Terry sought to bring all of that into the kind of that contextual idea and that model. And that's really where RT really shines and starts to come through. Another important thing with RT is it really does a great job of integrating the philosophy and theology of Martin Buber and really that understanding of the I and thou. In other words, that humanity finds meaning in relationship, which is why that's going to be a huge part, right? That relational ethical piece, that fairness question, that fairness piece. And so if I'm going to really find meaning within relationship, then if that's the case, then eventually it's always going to be that I and thou piece. And for Buber, it's going to be that the more I understand that I and thou, then it's going to bring me into relationship with the internal thou, which would be God and that understanding of that. So RT really integrates a lot of those modern approach, integrates some of that theological and philosophical framework, and then also integrates all of the work of the contextual framework and Dr. Naj and what all he had to offer. Now, the big thing with RT is that it's going to be based on two pillars. And those two pillars are love and trust. Now, love is essential in a family and is essential to individual, and not just in this flowery way, but being loved in the family, knowing that we're loved in the family really contributes to my understanding of my identity and really forming identity. So being loved is going to help the individual, help the child, and even into that point of helping the adult to understand that I'm unique and that I'm worthy. And in doing so, once I know I'm unique and worthy, I can turn to the thou, I can turn to the other, right, at that point, and work on that attachment to whomever that might be. So, for a child, that's going to be that attachment to mom and dad. For a spouse, that's going to be an attachment to my partner. And in doing so, knowing that I'm unique and worthy, I'm also able to answer that question of who am I, which is for RT is going to be the first question that humans ask of themselves. So just who am I? And so when we look at those that question of love, RT really focuses in on three understandings of types of love. That first love of companion love or friendship love is really going to tell us that we're not alone in the world, that we're able to have companions, right? That we're able to journey. So I am not alone. I've got others that I can rely on. Now, folks who come in and they talk, you'll hear those different types of love expressed. So I feel very alone in the world. Maybe I feel like I don't have any friends or I just feel very lonely. They're really speaking to that companionate love and that they don't feel unique in that sense of having that. Next being romantical love or passionate love, which is really kind of an obsessive love. In other words, I can't get you out of my mind, right? I've got all of these chemicals that are going. I'm infatuated with you. And that sort of intimate romantic love can last for my entire lifetime. If you have that really well bonded monogamous relationship of a married couple, you might see that. Or maybe it might also be really intense and passionate in a moment between a romantic couple. So we have that romantic love that goes there. And then finally, we also have an altruistic love. And I'm sorry, for with that romantic love lets me know that I am precious and I am wanted. Which is always nice to know, because if I'm precious and wanted, then I can turn around and do that, right? I can really want another, or I can desire, and we kind of get into all that intimacy at that point. Finally, we have altruistic love, or really sacrificial love, which altruistic love tells us that we are worthy. Now, knowing that we're worthy really also tells us that we have something to offer to others. Now, sacrificial love doesn't always necessarily mean, the extreme of that, of somebody dying. It might mean that, but it also might mean just parents making little sacrifices for their kids to make sure they have the best, making sure to work and give them the best education. That's a great form of altruistic love. Or a spouse just making sure that the partner is really cared for, maybe um, doing little things for them from time to time that might just be a little bit not the best thing for them. Those are good examples of altruistic love, of making sure that person knows that they're worthy. Knowing that I'm worthy allows me then to give to others. Now, knowing that type of love that folks are questioning and how they're experiencing that type of love is going to form those secure attachments, form those secure bonds that we have in life, and really build up an identity, right? Now let's focus in on that second pillar then of trust. Now, trust is essential because, and oftentimes we don't talk about it nearly enough, but trust is essential because it helps us to understand our safety within relationships. It supplies those essential relational resources that we need that allow us to give to one another freely. It allows us to form those secure bonds and really live those out. Now, the interesting thing about trust is it's built really on predictability. Now, in predictability, when you think about it, you can't have a chaotic environment to be able to trust, right? And so that means that we have to be predictable in our relationships about 85 to 90% of the time. So, in other words, the other person knows what to expect. They know what you're going to usually do, which is why a lot of times intimate couples or couples who've been together for a long time really have an understanding of one another, a really deep understanding of how that person operates and when something's a little bit off. That being said, too, for children, it's going to be hugely important. We need mom and dad to be reliable and predictable. We want them to be reliable and predictable, and it's going to give the child the best opportunity to thrive, right? Because it's going to form those boundaries. Now, so if trust is built with predictability, it's also built with openness. In other words, I'm not going to keep secrets. I'm going to be open to that give and take, and seeking that opportunity. I'm going to stay engaged, which is going to be a huge thing. I'm not just going to run away from you every time you want to talk about something hard, but I'm going to actually be open to whatever might pop up and whatever might come. And then finally is going to be, we're back on that question of fairness. So trust is going to grow when I have an understanding of that balanced ledger, right? I've got an understanding of that balance in that give and take, and I know that you're paying attention and you're able to hold that with me. Now, fairness over a period of time is going to produce a lot of trust and trustworthiness, which is going to build and bring up relational resources for everybody involved. So, that being said, now, when it comes to trust, we want to avoid the three-headed monster in relationship, which is going to be threat, manipulation, and withdrawal. Now, because those three things are going to just decimate love and trust in any relationship. And so, again, we want to avoid that three-headed monster of threat, manipulation, and withdrawal. Now, here's going to be a big part to this um, aspect of RT, and this is what really is kind of the bread and butter of RT, that when there is a violation to our understanding and our sense of love and trust. Now, a violation can mean a lot of things, but basically at that point, what's going on is that my midbrain, my amygdala is activated. I'm feeling danger, something's happening. And in that moment, a violation occurs that takes away from my sense of fairness. Well, the person gets stuck or they get frozen whenever that violation might be. At that point, we're going to see some coping behaviors pop up. Now, if the coping behavior happens to be in that sense of love, in that boundary of love, that boundary of my identity, those behaviors might turn out to be behaviors of blame, which would be a fight response, right? Or behaviors of self-shame, which would be a flight response at that point. If it's a violation and we see coping behaviors that are really about safety, then it's a question of trust. I've been violated in my pillar of trust. And so we're going to see probably some behaviors of control come out, or we might see some violations of, or some behaviors of escape, which are a lot of times also very chaotic in nature. So let's dive into those a little bit deeper about what that looks like. Now, this is really what's going on, though. A violation occurred outside of me. My midbrain lit up. My amygdala, which controls danger and fear, lit up. I felt that experience, and my prefrontal cortex got locked into whatever that response was. Now that response makes the most sense. So just to maybe look at that and give an example, maybe at some point I felt alone. And as a way of surviving that feeling, I had to get really, really angry. Well, now every time I feel alone, even if that's not the intent, the response I have, the pattern that I have formed now in my prefrontal cortex is to get really angry. Now all of a sudden I've got a bad pain cycle loop that gets me stuck. Now a lot of times what then happens is that love and trust pain informs one another. I felt alone and so I got angry. That was a question of identity. I blamed. And then with that, then relationships started getting hurt. So maybe at that point I felt really invalidated when I got angry. And so after I got angry, I ran away. Those patterns, since they inform each other, then become well ingrained. Now, looking at those behaviors again, if we're looking at that love understanding, and we see those behaviors of blame, those are that fight response that speak that someone should have loved me but didn't, right? Someone should have loved me but didn't. And so I'm justified in blaming the other person. I'm justified in that outward energy that you were wrong. Why would you do this to me? What are you thinking? Now, so this might include, you might see blame behaviors of anger, rage, retaliation, vengeance. And if there's any withdrawal in that, it's really going to be a withdrawal to punish. In other words, I'm going to walk away, but I'm going to make sure you know that you did something wrong. Now, the other side of that, the flight side to that, in that violation of love category, would be self-shame. So those self-shame behaviors are not really as much about what you feel as really about what you do, right? So why was I not loved? Did I do something? I must have done something wrong. Maybe I'm feeling really inadequate, or I'm feeling a little bit just broken. And so maybe in those moments you're going to see those behaviors of, maybe some whininess, some poutiness. This is where you might really see some depression, because it's really that flight behavior. I'm not going to be able to get out of bed because I just don't think highly enough about myself. Really that flight behavior response to that violation of my sense of who I am. Now, on the other side, when we start looking at those trust behaviors of control and escape, we're looking at that violation of my sense of safety. And so I have to really respond to something outside of me. When we look at those control behaviors, they're really going to stem from not feeling the openness that I can depend on somebody else, that I can rely on somebody else. It's all about me. So when we use control, we tend to be really great performers. So a lot of times, even in the therapy room, we might hear of folks with control really struggling maybe with panic attacks. A lot of times very anxiety prone, right? Highly judgmental, really just not able to have a lot of patience. And then if there's any sort of withdrawal, it's really going to be a withdrawal to defend the self. A lot of times it feels like that person just goes into a tank and nobody can get back in, of, kind of I'm above you, you're not getting in here. And so children or partners or parents are going to be knocking on that tank trying to get in, and they can't get there, right? If it's a violation, again, of safety, and I go in that flight response of escape, it's really going to be that I'm not feeling very safe. And so I basically, I just go offline. I run away. Life is too messed up. A lot of times, I always love it because at that point, clients are saying like, it just wasn't worth it, right? Life is already messed up. Why would I deal with that? And so it's always about making those things less intolerable. And so a lot of times it's going to be very unpredictable behavior that then comes out, because especially for folks who are using escape, what usually happens is they'll throw a bomb so then they can get out, right? So a lot of times we'll see behaviors that are very impulsive. They create a lot of drama. And then there's a lot, my favorite, and to be honest with you, my go-to is a little bit of dissociation. Maybe I get kind of lost in some fantasy, or it's just a lot easier to be introverted and be by themselves. So it's a lot easier in that moment to connect to inanimate things also. So this is a lot of times where you'll see addictions pop up. Addiction is going to be throughout, but this for escape especially, because it's a lot easier to connect to a bottle, to connect to drugs, to connect to pornography, to connect to gambling, than it is to maybe stay engaged and really connect with whatever is causing the pain. And so we have those coping behaviors of blame, self-shame, control, and escape based on those two pillars of love and trust. Now, those coping behaviors, as I mentioned earlier, are going to then create those patterns that feed one another, and they become really ingrained. So when people come into therapy, it all makes sense to them. Again, we're in that spot of I'm entitled to do this behavior regardless of how it impacts the other. Again, that's where we talk about the destructive entitlement that's being formed. When I was a kid, I felt alone. And when I felt alone that time, I would get so angry at mom and dad. Well, now I'm married and have my own kids. And now when that pops up and I feel alone, is it still right for me to get as angry as I do? We have to be able to challenge that entitlement a little bit. We have to be able to challenge that coping behavior so that people can find new opportunities to do something with that. So for an RT therapist, the main goal then is going to be to utilize our resources, which is to organize, sequence, and structure. And so by organize there, what I mean is that we're going to really listen to the client's story. We're going to be super engaged. So that is going to be one thing that marks an RT therapist. Is it's not a whole lot of just passively listening and asking how you feel, but it's really not letting the person get too lost down too many rabbit holes. Because what you're trying to help the person do is really tap into what pain response they're talking about. So a lot of times for me, what that's going to mean is that I'm really asking a lot of questions just to build on whatever pain behavior piece I hear. So you keep talking about being angry. Can you tell me a little bit more about like how long in your life have you been angry? What are the feelings that are driving that? Oh, wow. Okay, I hear that. What does that say about you, do you think? How did it impact you? How did that make you feel loved? And so you're constantly sort of helping that person really be organized in splitting those out. I like to kind of explain it to my clients in this way. So if you get a cut, say you get a cut at the same time, same depth, but the first cut's on your finger, the second cut's on your leg, right? Does your brain really feel the pain any differently? Not really, does it? Like pain is pain. The nice thing though, when it's outside of our body, well, when it's outside your body, are you going to use the same bandage for a cut you have on your finger versus a cut you have on your leg? Probably not. On your finger, you need to probably use a small bandage. On your leg, you need to use a big bandage. Same thing is true in our head. We have to find what cut is going on so we know which bandage to apply. But for the most part, when people are experiencing that pain, they'll come in and they'll talk about the pain as if it's one big cut. And so our goal is to really organize the cuts, right? Really figure out, oh, when you feel alone, that's when you get angry. But then when you feel invalidated, that's when you escape. And then maybe at that point, you're feeling just really inadequate about who you are. And that's when you kind of fall into a depression. And see, now we're starting to really map out the pattern. And so that's where at that point, we really want to lean into sequencing with the client. Once they start to organize in a little way, then at that point, we're going to sequence it. And what that really looks like is repeating the narrative over and over and over again and helping the client to make sense of that confusing pain. So we're going to slow it down. Hey, did you hear yourself say that? What do you think that was? Let me just make sure I really understand what you just said. Could you just repeat that for me? We're going to constantly kind of sequence it for the client, help them to really recognize, all right, they've organized the cuts, and now recognize them as they go. And then finally, then we get to that structure. Now, here's the neat part. At that point, we've got a pretty simple map that we can follow to map out the pain cycle, right? So when I feel this way, this is what I typically do to cope with it. And then the more important part is how do I start seeing other people respond? Now, that's going to be the key because, again, if I make meaning in relationships, if I start to see that when I feel alone, I get really angry, well, that starts becoming a reality to me when I start noticing how other people respond to my anger. That when I get angry, my kids cower. Do I want to do that? Do I want my kids to be afraid of me and to cower? Now we're challenging that pain that I always felt entitled to. So in RT, our goal is really about self-emotional regulation at that point, which is going to lead then to balanced ledgers in those horizontal relationships. Now, when it comes to parents and kids, those vertical relationships, we're still going to try to help a little bit with self-regulation on the side of mom and dad. But co-regulation for mom and dad with kids is okay because kids are trying to understand and they're trying to make sense of their emotions already and they're learning. So they're really learning their pain and peace cycle, right? But the important part there, and this is critically important, is that co-regulation is okay for kids. It's not okay for parents because parents cannot dump their pain cycle onto the kid because at that point we get that parentification loop, right? So I can't say, well, you always make me feel alone to the kid, and so you just have to deal with my anger. Well, that's not fair. But a parent can help their child who is also struggling with anger understand what it's like to feel alone and the intricacies of that. So that's going to be the big difference there. When it's a horizontal relationship, we're seeking to balance the ledger. When it's a vertical relationship, we're really seeking a little bit more. We're trying to teach self-regulation, but it'll often look a little bit more like that co-regulation between parent and child, with the parent teaching, not the other way around. Because again, it can never go upstream. So Once the pain cycle is recognized and really sort of fleshed out and people have good understanding about that, we can start to use interventions to help the clients to really start to find the truth about themselves. So typically in RT, we're going to use some form of imagery and embodiment intervention. So, but the neat thing, one thing I really love about RT, it doesn't matter what you use. So we've got the full spectrum of therapy models that we can sort of pull from, as long as whatever that intervention is helps the person to feel and practice their pain cycle in the moment. We want that pain in the room because that's the sweet spot. If it's in the room, we can notice it and practice it so that we can recognize it outside the room. Now, the typical ones for RT are going to be reparenting imagery, the split screen imagery, or maybe even the stronger, better self imagery. And so, what that usually looks like is some sort of guided meditation where maybe we're having somebody speak to an empty chair, for example, and do that reparenting imagery. So, I'm going to speak to my younger self and help them to understand, no, you're not alone, buddy. I know it feels sometimes like you're alone, but you're not alone. That's not the truth of who you are. So I'm speaking that truth, and my brain is hearing that truth. We start to get those peace cycles mapped out. Now, here's the fun part. Most people in that pain cycle, it's going to take us like 6 to 8 sessions to really map out that pain cycle. Typically, the peace cycle takes 1 session because once we're really familiar with our pain, it doesn't make any sense anymore. We've challenged that entitlement piece. Sometimes I feel alone. But the truth about me is I'm not alone. I don't have to be angry. I can choose to be nurturing. So now as therapists, we get to structure that and we map it out, which we would call the peace cycle. That the truth about me is this, and when I know that to be true, this is how I choose to act. And when I choose to act this way, this is how I see other people respond. Now, that's going to be based on this idea that once I'm grounded in the truth of who I am, I don't have to give into pain. I can rest in peace and comfort. And so if it's a matter of that question of identity, that question of love, then instead of blame and self-shame, we'll see nurturing behaviors or valuing self behaviors. And if it's a question about that question of safety or trust, well, if I know that I'm safe and I'm grounded in that truth that I'm safe, then instead of seeing control behaviors, we might see balanced behaviors, specifically balance in give and take, right? And openness. If it's a question of escape, well, instead of escaping and running away, I'm going to be reliably connected. Emphasis on reliably. I'm going to stay in the chair. I'm going to be with you throughout all of this. Now, in doing so, we're empowering clients to really choose instead of just living and surviving with those coping behaviors that may or may not have ever been really challenged or confronted before. Now, by getting clients to that point of recognizing their truth and mapping out that peace cycle, only good things and only good decisions that at that point can come from that. And in doing so, people find themselves to be grounded. They find themselves to be comfortable, right? And at that point, we're able to recognize some things. So if I'm nurturing instead of blaming, what I'm really saying is that you belong to me. I have the ability to really listen. I'm not alone. If it's a matter of valuing self, I've got something to say and it's valuable. I'm able to nurture myself. I don't have to rely on you to come take care of me. If it's a matter of that balance and give and take, I'm gonna give certain things. And part of that giving is also that you are not mine to control. And so I've got that ability now to be a little bit vulnerable and the ability to cooperate. I don't have to compete. I don't have to compromise to get anything. And then finally, that space of being reliably connected is really allowing the action of trust. I'm going to put distance between me and my pain, and I'm going to stay. Now, here's kind of a warning there for escape, is that most timeouts, so if you're working with couples or most timeouts turn into withdrawal. So if you got someone that struggles with escape, timeouts are not always super helpful. By timeouts, I mean maybe we're just going to stop for a second and separate for a little while, and then we'll try to come back for it. Well, if you have an escaper, they're not coming back, even if they are grounded. So part of it is training that even if somebody becomes angry, I've got to kind of stick with it. Now, again, that raises questions of safety, so we have to really kind of flush through that and practice that grounding. Um, but that's going to be an important part, that I'm not just going to escape at that point. Now, once we structure the peace cycle, at that point, then we've got our pain cycle, we've got our peace cycle, we've challenged that destructive entitlement, we're starting to rebalance the ledger. And so to do that, what we need to do is start practicing the 4 steps. We're going to do a little bit of mindfulness exercise here, right? So we just looked at our attachment questions. Now we're looking at mindfulness, which is really to say um, that I know that at some point I experienced this violation and my brain has gotten a little stuck. Well, now I'm going to start slowing it down. And here's going to be the biggest piece to this, is that clients have to say it out loud and they have to practice it. It can't just be a mental exercise where they gain insight and then nothing happens. So we're going to really work on, and I always kind of tease my clients, you're going to get so annoyed with me. You've got the blueprint, you know what to do. And if we don't do the 4 steps, we're getting nowhere, right? And so those 4 steps look like this, and it's very simple. When I feel this way, and they're gonna state their pain cycle feeling. So when I feel alone, step 2, this is what I typically do. Typically I get really angry. But the truth about me, so step 3, what's my truth? Well, the truth is I'm not alone. I know I'm not alone. Well, if that's the truth, I can choose to do something different here. I don't have to get angry. Or if I'm going to get angry, I'm going to do it in a way that works for me. So what is that little thing you're going to do? I always love that step 4, because really at that point we're doing a little bit of science, right? We've got a hypothesis with our first 3. Now we're going to use an experiment and participate in a little peer review, right? So at that point, we're going to really work on practicing those 4 steps, because here's the cool thing. Practice, 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 practice. If we are able to start practicing the 4 steps, well, a client who practiced them uh, um, the 4 steps 10 times in 2 weeks, just 10 times, 2 weeks, they're going to know at that point their pain and peace cycles by heart. Um, if they practice it 18 times in 3 weeks, they'll begin to be able to really look forward and kind of see it coming. They're going to see the patterns start to arise. 24 times in a month, that's it, just 24 times in a month, and they'll be able to catch their pain cycle before it ever pops up. At that point, now it's habitual, right? I've learned that habit. I've broken the bad habit. I've broken that entitlement, and I can be on top of it, right? So what we want to do once we get those pain and peace cycles mapped out, once we get to the 4 steps, is we kind of want to ratchet up the intensity, and we want to really stick with those 4 steps. Now, here's kind of the important part with that too, is that when we're in the room and we're able to work with that pain, we can also help teach the clients how to calm down. And there you're going to just use whatever simple skills that we might be able to use. And so one of the most easiest there would be bilateral stimulation, which is just literally, okay, you're feeling alone. Can you do me a favor? And this is what I usually do with clients, but there's lots of options. You can toss a ball back and forth. You can get some lotion, and the 2 of you just kind of lotion some hands. I'm a drummer by background. We've got our guitar up here. We like the music piece. And so what I'll have my clients do with me is slow it down, sit up straight, put their hands on their legs, and then we'll do drumming exercises on our knees. And then I'll switch it up and have do 2-2, right? That way, what we're doing is we're getting both sides of our brain a little bit back in alignment. We're slowing it down. I'm just feeling alone right now. I need to calm down. When I feel alone, that's when I get angry. Truth about me is I'm not alone. And so this is what I want to choose to do instead. So the nice thing is, when you're practicing that with clients in the room, really help them to recognize that emotional dysregulation outside the room, so that when they get out into the world, they've really got that built up and really open up those opportunities to repair love and trust. Now, finally, our big goal here, just like in contextual therapy, is really exoneration. And in RT, we refer to that as the work of forgiveness. And in doing so, we're putting back or we're restoring love and trust. It doesn't mean we're forgetting whatever that pain was. We're just restoring love and trust and being grounded in the truth. And so where once it was violated, now it's restored. And so that understanding of forgiveness really falls under, again, we like our pillars, two pillars, right? Of really salvaging um, and restoration. Now, in salvaging, we have two stages. We have insight and understanding. Insight, meaning I'm gaining just some insight into the context of what was going on, right? So maybe I'm gaining some insight into the, again, into the dimensions that were happening. So I'm getting some insight that, my dad's dad drank a lot. Oh, then it makes sense that my dad drank a lot, right? It was modeled for him. And so that insight that goes there, which also might lead to some understanding why that person, oh, that's why he always drank, right? And so we've got those two pieces of just salvaging that bit. Maybe I'm so angry with dad for so long over his drinking, but now I'm able to have that insight and understanding. Now, these stages are not linear. They go back and forth. And so when I'm working in that pillar of salvaging, it's gonna, sometimes clients might stick in that insight space for a while. Sometimes they might be in understanding for a while. Sometimes they may go back and forth, and that's okay. Now, the next piece to that then, in that work of forgiveness, the next pillar is going to be that restoration piece. And then this is more action oriented. And so that first stage there of salvaging is going to be that giving opportunity for compensation. In other words, that might look like something like reaching out to dad, giving him an opportunity to say, I'm sorry, letting him know that, dad, I really need to talk to you about how your drinking impacted me. Whatever it might be. The fun part is you get to work it out with your client, whatever they're comfortable with and where they need to challenge themselves. That's okay. But really it's about opening up. I have felt entitled for so long to be angry with dad, and now I've got to open up some opportunity for him to apologize, right? Now, on that next piece, there also might be some overt forgiving. This is where a specific action is being done. Now, that can be a very creative opportunity that you get to work out with clients. So maybe it's you and you're working with a couple, and they come up with this overt action of maybe they come up with like a little monument that they put in their yard to remind them about that forgiveness, right? Or maybe they come up with a ritual, or maybe there was an affair, and to make up for the affair, this is now what we have in place, right? So there's that overt opportunity to forgive, and there's a specific action being done for it. Now, those things go back and forth. Again, these stages are not linear. They kind of circle, and they go back around, and they go back and forth, and so forth and so on. The important piece with that, though, is that it does not matter. Again, we're seeking self-regulation, not co-regulation. It does not matter the outcome from the other person. What matters is I've reached that level of forgiveness. So dad might never stop drinking, but at least now I've been able to find and salvage my relationship because I've got some insight and understanding about dad and who he was. So all of a sudden, dad's not a monster anymore. He's a human again. And now I'm finding ways for me to take action to forgive and to also form healthy boundaries around that. That's going to be really the goal then in RT, is getting to that point of rebalancing the ledger and seeking and building on that work of forgiveness, precisely because we've shook up the destructive entitlement, we've earned some retirement, we've restored love and trust, and now we've really found something to jump in and go off of. So thank you so much for walking through. There's so much more that goes into these models, of course, but RT is my favorite, and so I've so loved working with it and seeing the impact it has on my clients, seeing the impact it's had on me, and I'm thankful and excited to get to share that with you today. So thank you, and good luck in your walk in love and trust.